This is one of the most problematic roller coasters ever built, Batman and Robin the Chiller at Six Flags Great Adventure. It opened for just a few days in 1997 before issues shut it down for nearly a year. The $15 million prototype launching roller coaster used an electromagnetic launch to propel trains into a thrilling layout, as well as a second electromagnetic launch high in the air which gave trains the needed speed to repeat the course in reverse, making the ride a shuttle coaster. The attraction wasn't just one roller coaster, but two, and double the tracks meant double the problems. The Chiller had two other counterparts, Mr. Freeze at Six Flags Over Texas and Mr. Freeze at Six Flags St. Louis. They each cost $10 million and are the same prototype ride model as the Chiller. In one of the riskiest theme park moves ever, Six Flags attempted to open all four of these prototype coasters at the same time. This $35 million gamble had disastrous consequences, leading to an embarrassing opening year akin to the failed 2024 opening of Top Thrill 2 at Cedar Point, but on a much grander scale. In this video, we'll discuss the insanity of opening these four prototype coasters at once, the issues that plagued the attractions, and why the Chiller closed after less than a decade of operations in 2007. Thankfully, the two Mr. Freeze coasters are still in operation today. They're perfectly safe and offer what I find to be one of the best coaster experiences out there, so hopefully they stick around for many more years to come. If you enjoy the video as it plays, I kindly ask for your support by liking the video, as that helps the channel greatly against the YouTube algorithm. Without further delay, let's dive into the intricacies of these design-flawed launching shuttle roller coasters. As we discussed in the last problematic roller coasters video, when the Outer Limits Flight of Fear opened in 1996 at Paramount's Kings Island and Paramount's Kings Dominion, they were the first roller coasters to feature electromagnetic launches. Linear induction motors, or LIMs, take trains from 0 to 54 miles per hour in 4 seconds. Today, this acceleration rate has been greatly outdone by more reliable and energy-efficient linear synchronous motors, or LSMs. But in 1996, the launch on Flight of Fear was a thrill unlike anything else. Both Flight of Fears were built by the ride manufacturer known today as Premier Rides. At the time, Premier Rides was divided into 3 separate entities, with Phoenix Rides being the entity that delivered the Flight of Fears. Jim Shea, the current president of Premier Rides, was then the president of Phoenix Rides. Not only were the Flight of Fears prototype attractions, but they were the first coasters fully manufactured by Phoenix Rides. Adapting electromagnetic launch technology to roller coasters was quite the gamble and came with a lot of risk. A long list of issues related to the launch system and ride vehicles caused both Flight of Fears to open 2 months late. In the years following, a great deal of money and effort went towards correcting many issues with both attractions, such as structural deficiencies, a rough ride experience, and the launch systems overburdening their respective electrical grids. The Flight of Fears also never met the rider capacity they were intended to, and to this day they still only run trains of 5 cars each instead of the intended 6 cars each. Even with the long list of issues the Flight of Fears possessed and the extra work it took to correct them, the innovative launch technology and unmatched ride experience were enough to convince Six Flags to purchase their own limb launching roller coasters from Phoenix Rides. And in the continuous pursuit to deliver more innovative and thrilling roller coasters, Six Flags and Phoenix Rides developed even faster and larger launching roller coasters that utilized limbs in an even more daring manner. And in the process, they created a prototype launching shuttle coaster, as limbs would not only be used for the main launch, but also for trains to repeat the circuit in reverse. When building a prototype roller coaster, it's best to build just one of them at a time. This way, any issues or design flaws can be accounted for and corrected with subsequent installations of the same ride model. Paramount assumed an incredible risk with the debut of 2 prototype attractions simultaneously, as issues with the attractions forced both parks to open their brand new roller coasters 2 months late. Then a lot of time, money, and effort went towards correcting issues that were present in both attractions for several years. Where had Paramount initially built only one Flight of Fear, the issues with the first model could have been adapted directly into the second Flight of Fear, making for a much more streamlined process. I'm sure Six Flags were well aware of the difficulties with debuting two Flight of Fears, but they went ahead and doubled Paramount's risk with the simultaneous debut of 4 prototype coasters. On December 18, 1996, Six Flags Over Texas in Arlington, Texas, announced they would be opening Mr. Freeze in the spring of 1997. Its limb launch would catapult trains from 0 to 70 miles per hour in 3.78 seconds, and the ride would be Texas's tallest and fastest roller coaster. In late January 1997, Six Flags St. Louis in Eureka, Missouri announced they would also be opening a Mr. Freeze roller coaster in the spring of 1997, and it would be a mirror image clone of the Texas Mr. Freeze. Both rides would feature a 150-foot tall inverted top hat following the limb launch. Next would be an overbanked turn banked at 120 degrees, which at the time was coined a wraparound turn. Following would be an insane 218-foot tall vertical spike, with another set of limbs mounted high in the air, giving trains the necessary speed to complete the circuit in reverse. On February 13, 1997, Six Flags Great Adventure in Jackson, New Jersey officially announced a pair of launching shuttle coasters, Batman and Robin the Chiller. It would be slightly smaller and slower than the Mr. Freezes, with a top speed of 65 miles per hour and a maximum height of 200 feet. But as an upgrade, its 2 tracks would create a dueling experience, as the rides were meant to launch simultaneously. Interestingly, this would be the 3rd dual-tracked coaster Great Adventure had built, following 1978's Lightning Loops and 1979's Rolling Thunder. One track would be painted red in theme to Robin, and the other painted blue in theme to Batman. Following the limb launch, Robin would feature a 105-foot tall Cobra roll, while Batman featured a 139-foot tall inverted top hat like the Mr. Freezes. Next, both tracks would flip through a 0G roll and ascend a 200-foot tall 45-degree incline, with another set of limbs mounted high in the air, giving trains the needed speed to repeat the layout in reverse just like on the Mr. Freezes. At the time, Time Warner, which now goes by Warner Bros. Discovery, was the parent company of Six Flags. They were set to release a Batman and Robin movie in June of 1997, starring many noteworthy actors. For promotional purposes, the new roller coasters would be themed to the new movie and open alongside the movie's release. The main villain of the movie was Mr. Freeze, an infamous arch nemesis of Batman who builds a freeze gun to freeze over all of Gotham City. Thus, on the Mr. Freeze roller coasters, guests board into the evil genius's freeze gun and are blasted to freeze the city, whereas on Batman and Robin the Chiller, riders board into projectile vehicles and are blasted out of the freeze generator as they fight alongside Batman and Robin to defeat Mr. Freeze. Six Flags even worked with Warner Bros. To recreate sets from the movie, including the Gotham Observatory, which Mr. Freeze breaks into to create his freeze gun. Six Flags recreated the observatory and placed it at the end of the Chiller's launch tracks, blasting riders through it as they defeat Mr. Freeze. In the 1990s, most major roller coasters were still built to churn through over 1,000 riders an hour, something that can't be said about many of today's new roller coasters. Even as shuttle coasters, they were all built to theoretically do over 1,000 riders per hour, thanks to the use of multiple train operations. Typically, shuttle coasters are only able to operate one train, since trains travel in 2 directions on the same circuit of track, making multiple train operations impossible. The Chiller would operate a single train on each track, meaning the overall attraction ran 2 trains, hitting an advertised 1,600 riders per hour. Then with the Mr. Freezes having just one track, a transfer table built into the station would allow 2 trains to safely run on the same track, yielding an advertised 1,300 riders per hour. Later in the video, we'll go into much more detail on this. Each of the Six Flags shuttle coasters were announced to open in the spring of 1997, but the late construction of them suggested otherwise. In the fall of 1996, Great Adventure made room for the Chiller by relocating the looping Starship and Scrambler to the park's boardwalk area. To help make way, the park even removed its second smaller Ferris wheel named the Little Wheel. Beyond this work, construction seemed to stall significantly. At Six Flags Over Texas, vertical construction did not begin until late March of 1997, when at that point, most of the coaster should have already been built. Construction of the Chiller looked to follow the same schedule. On March 27th, when Great Adventure opened for the year, only a few support pieces and the steel framing of the station building had been erected. Thankfully, construction progressed pretty rapidly during the month of April, as more and more of the new rides were put in place. The short track length of the new coasters also aided in the quick construction of them. The new rides featured much denser support structures compared to the Flight of Fears, likely in an effort to avoid the structural issues seen in the Flight of Fears. Each track of the chiller would use 50 pairs of limbs, with 43 pairs on the main launch tracks and 7 pairs for the boost launch. Each limb holds 2 stators, meaning 200 stators would power each track, and the entire attraction would have a total of 400 stators. On the other hand, each Mr. Freeze would use 54 pairs of limbs, with 44 pairs on the main launch and 10 pairs on the boost launch, yielding a total of 212 stators for the entire attraction. The limbs were manufactured by Winkle Electric Company, who was the exclusive US agent for the British firm Force Engineering. This ties back to Flight of Fear, whose limbs were created by Force Engineering. Construction of the chiller seemed uniform, with the ride's cube, station building, observatory, and electrical work progressing alongside the building of the coaster, whereas the construction of the station building and surrounding area for the Texas Mr. Freeze didn't begin until mid-May of 1997. Apparently, unusually high rainfall in Texas that year delayed construction of the Texas Mr. Freeze compared to the others. The chiller allegedly cycled its first test run on May 17, 1997. I believe the Batman track was tested first, as on the day before, the Batman train was spotted on the maintenance tracks unwrapped from its protective shipping plastic, whereas the Robin train was still wrapped in its plastic. On May 23, 1997, Great Adventure officially announced the chiller's media day would be on June 3rd, and the ride would open to the public the day after. As planned, media day for the chiller took place on June 3rd, and the ride opened to the public the next day. While most online sources claim the chiller soft opened on June 7, 1997, the newspaper articles I'm sourcing all indicate a true opening day of June 4, 1997. Early reviews of the chiller were quite glowing, with Paul Rubin, a famous member of the American Coaster Enthusiasts and former editor of Roller Coaster magazine, having this to say: "From the moment you blast out of the loading platform, the thrills come unrelentingly. The chiller not only made my blood run cold, it gave a real adrenaline rush. I had no idea what was happening when I was going backwards. I felt like a ragdoll." As the video continues, it's helpful to understand how limbs work. As a recap from my Flight of Fear video, limbs are an adaptation of traditional electric induction motors. Induction motors are used in a wide variety of applications. They're what make appliances like ceiling fans or washing machines spin. They drive the wheels of an electric vehicle, and are even used in the tire drives of roller coasters that move ride vehicles along controlled sections of track. Induction motors are made of 2 key components. First is the stator, which is a circular stationary part made of electromagnets and copper windings. The second component is the rotor, which is a cylindrical rotating part inside the stator that is able to conduct electricity. When the stator is powered with electricity, it creates a rotating magnetic field. The magnetic field created by the stator induces a current in the rotor, causing the rotor to generate its own magnetic field. The magnetic field of the rotor then interacts with the stator's rotating magnetic field, causing it to try and frantically catch up to the rotating magnetic field of the stator as it attempts to eliminate the difference in motion between the two. This creates torque as the rotor spins in the direction of the magnetic field. For linear induction motors, the stator is essentially unwrapped from a round shape into a flat linear shape. In the case of the shuttle coasters, these linear stators are grouped together in pairs, with each motor housing holding a stator on the top and stator on the bottom. In between the stators is a very small gap of just 20 millimeters for the rotor of the system. In this system, the rotor is also unwrapped and laid out flat as separate sheets of conductive metal plates called reactor plates. The reactor plates are primarily made of aluminum and are attached to the left and right side of each of the ride's cars. When the launch stators are powered with immense amounts of 3-phase alternating current, they create a traveling magnetic field, which moves across the length of the stator linearly rather than rotationally like in traditional induction motors. This induces a current in the reactor plates, causing the reactor plates to generate their own magnetic fields. Just like with traditional induction motors, the magnetic fields of the reactor plates attempt to catch up to the traveling magnetic field of the stators, causing them to move linearly. The launch control system continues to influence the motion of the coaster by firing the corresponding limbs to the train's location, which continues to attract and propel the reactor plates forward with a high amount of thrust. But achieving this high thrust level requires an extremely tight gap between the reactor plates and stators at just a few millimeters, meaning the track and structure of the launch build of the trains, and mounting of the limbs must be pinpoint accurate. With the Flight of Fears, this tight tolerance was a major reason the rides opened 2 months late, as the reactor plates would actually crash into the limbs and crumple like aluminum foil. The new shuttle coasters would power their limbs with even more electricity compared to the Flight of Fears, which wound up increasing the severity of this issue. Flight of Fear's launch powers with 480 volt 3-phase AC power with a maximum current of 4,200 to 4,500 amps, but this peak is held for just 1 second. Afterwards, the current drops to an average of 3,000 amps for the remainder of the launch. The new shuttle coasters would also power their launches with 480 volt 3-phase AC power, but at an even higher current of 5,000 amps sustained for 3 seconds instead of just 1. I believe the boost limbs would also power with 5,000 amps. Interestingly, the limbs on the new shuttle coasters would be the same as the ones from Flight of Fear, even if they powered with a higher current. Allegedly, the limbs were fine-tuned to handle this additional power, but as we'll discuss shortly, the motor housings of the limbs were not sufficient. The placement of the boost limbs so high in the air would also pose many challenges not common with most roller coasters. On the night of June 7th, 1997, the Texas Mr. Freeze finally started testing. It was reported that rather loud noises could be heard as the train rode up and down through the boost limbs, a sign the reactor plates were likely striking the limbs. Each night following, the Texas Mr. Freeze would test more and more. While testing on the night of June 10th, 1997, an alleged incident caused the train to valley between the vertical spike and overbank turn. Valleying is where a roller coaster train doesn't have enough speed to ride up and over a hill, causing it to roll back and forth between 2 high points until it runs out of speed and comes to a stop at a low point. Bystanders reported hearing a sound as if something had broken off the train as it rode through the boost limbs, indicating the reactor plates may have collided with the boost limbs, likely causing the reactor plates to break off. This incident halted testing of the Texas Mr. Freeze, and its boost limbs were later removed from the vertical spike on June 12th. Prior to the incident, the Missouri Mr. Freeze had its media day set for earlier that same day on June 10th, with its grand opening set for the day after. However, its media day was cancelled last second, likely due to another reason, but the Texas Mr. Freeze incident would keep the coaster closed for much longer. As we just discussed, the chiller had officially opened nearly a week prior, but interestingly, the Texas Mr. Freeze incident did not shut down the chiller, as at the time of the incident, the chiller had reportedly already been closed for several days due to another issue, which we'll discuss later in the video. On June 15th, 1997, the chiller's boost limbs were removed from the 45-degree incline. You can see here the empty steel brackets that the limbs are normally mounted to. On June 29th, 1997, Fort Worth Star-Telegram released a news article with comments from Phoenix Rides president Jim Shea. The article essentially confirmed the incident on the night of June 10th, and stated that as the train's fins glided through the limbs, the rail-like motors closed onto the fins, damaging the vehicle. Shea confirmed that because of the incident, any operation of the Six Flags shuttle coasters had stopped, and all the limbs from the coasters were entirely removed. Shea commented further that the limbs were modified and stiffened to correct them from closing, and had already been remounted to the Texas Mr. Freeze to resume testing. Mounting the limbs is no easy task, as they need to be installed with pinpoint accuracy. Shea commented in the article that the gaps in each limb can only be 1 millimeter out of alignment. Accurately mounting each limb on the flat launch track is already challenging, but imagine the difficulty of installing the limbs with exact precision at roughly 150 feet in the air at a 90-degree angle. When the rides were constructed, the limbs were mounted to the track at ground level. Then the track piece with its limbs already attached was hoisted to position and attached to the structure. But that was not the case this time around. From what I understand, a limb had never shut closed on the Flight of Fears, and the main issues had to do with the limbs and reactor plates staying in alignment, as well as the reactor plates warping due to the high heat created by the limbs. But for the Texas Mr. Freeze, the added power surging through the stators was so strong that a pair of stators were able to fold the steel housing supporting them, allowing the reactors to sandwich together against the reactor plates. And since the other shuttle coasters used the exact same limbs and also powered with the same amount of electricity, the same issue could potentially repeat with them. The Texas Mr. Freeze allegedly began testing the same night the news article released on June 29th, but the first full-powered cycle once again valleyed between the vertical spike and overbank turn. Thankfully, this valley was likely due to the boost limbs not fully engaging and was not related to more damage to the ride system. Testing resumed shortly after, with trains successfully completing cycle after cycle. Reportedly, there was no longer any clunking noises as trains passed through the boost limbs, an indication the reactor fins were no longer striking the limbs. Though it should be noted that when the reactor plates strike the limbs, they only strike the steel guide brackets shown here, which are meant to prevent the reactor plates from striking the actual stators. The brackets eat into some of the gap between the stators, which is why the reactor plates are more susceptible to striking them. From what I gather, the sounds of the reactor plate striking these steel brackets makes it sound worse than it actually is. Going forward, all efforts to fix the shuttle coasters took place at the Texas Mr. Freeze. Robin's Red Train was reportedly seen cycling the track of the Texas Mr. Freeze, as all the shuttle coaster trains allegedly required modifications. Shortly after, the stiffened limbs were installed on the Missouri Mr. Freeze and both tracks of the chiller, and the 3 coasters began testing as well. Nighttime testing continued vigorously at all the coasters, but by late July 1997, the new coasters remained closed with no opening in sight, and the parks had even stopped advertising them. Allegedly, this was due to new issues related to overheating of the launch and brake systems, with trains returning to the launch tracks at a very high speed. A reliable brake system was needed that wouldn't wear out too quickly. Thus, the shuttle coasters were amongst the first roller coasters to feature contactless magnetic braking. The main braking force is provided by powerful permanent magnets mounted to the track that interact with vertically mounted steel fins beneath the trains. Eddy currents are created as the fins pass through the magnets, which slows down each train. Apparently, the steel fins mounted to the trains were overheating, causing the brake system to be less effective than intended, meaning a set of friction brakes following the magnetic brakes had to be used more intensely than it was meant to, which wasn't ideal. On top of that, with testing now occurring on hot summer days, the launch system was overheating, with both the limbs and reactor plates reaching extremely hot temperatures. I've heard that between each cycle, the limbs or reactor plates required as much as 4 to 5 minutes to cool down. Rumors also circulated that while the ride underwent a high launch rate certification, some stators were even cracking due to reaching wildly hot temperatures. To mitigate the issues, fans were installed on the station tracks of every shuttle coaster to cool the reactor plates and magnetic brake fins. Here are fans installed on the Missouri Mr. Freeze in the summer of 1997. From what I understand, this worked quite well, and both Mr. Freezes still use blower fans to keep the reactor plates and magnetic brake fins cool to this day. But even with this fix, the new coasters still hadn't opened by September of 1997, as yet another issue had presented itself, and this issue would be the last straw on keeping the rides closed until 1998. When the limb housings were stiffened earlier that summer, only portions of them were stiffened. While the stiffening did its job and prevented each pair of stators from sandwiching together, they did not eliminate the immense forces at work. Thus, all the force and stresses concentrated on the unstiffened parts of the limb housings, causing them to fatigue and develop stress fractures. This wasn't an easy fix and required brand new housings to be engineered that could sustain the immense power of the stators. However, this would take several months, eliminating any chance at a 1997 opening. Six Flags assumed an incredible risk with their attempt to open 4 prototype roller coasters simultaneously, and the company absolutely suffered the consequences, as not just 1 but 3 parks missed out on opening their brand new multi-million-dollar attractions, meaning the additions were essentially a waste for the 1997 season. As work began to re-engineer the limb housings, the Missouri Mr. Freeze became the central test subject. Six Flags St. Louis closed for the season much earlier than Six Flags Over Texas. On the night of October 6th, the Missouri Mr. Freeze was seen testing again, as engineers likely gathered immense amounts of data related to the stress the limb housings were enduring. Since Six Flags Over Texas opened for the 1998 season much earlier than Six Flags St. Louis and Great Adventure, the Texas Mr. Freeze was prioritized to open first, and it began receiving its newly manufactured limbs before the other shuttle coasters. Six Flags Over Texas was scheduled to open for the season on February 28th, so its Mr. Freeze Freeze was intensely tested in the hopes it would be ready for the park's opening day. However, the 1998 season began, and Mr. Freeze remained closed. In the meantime, the Chiller and Missouri Mr. Freeze also received their new limbs and began testing. Apparently, things were going well enough that both rides would open alongside their respective parks for the start of the 1998 season in early April. Taking a look at the original limbs, the steel housings featured little reinforcement. At the top of the housings looked to have been a very thin sheet of steel. The outer wall of the housing behind the stators also looked to be made of a thin sheet of steel. Taking a look at the limbs the rides actually opened with, the steel housings became much thicker above, behind, and below the stators. Rib-like reinforcements were also built into the steel housings, repeating across the entire length of each limb. This reinforced housing is the same design still used today on the attractions, and it appears the limb housings on the Flight of Fears were later updated to use the stronger design as well. On Wednesday, March 25th, Media Day was held for Mr. Freeze at Six Flags Over Texas, and on March 28th, the ride officially opened to the public. After nearly a year of addressing never-ending issues, one of the shuttle coasters had finally opened following the Chiller's brief run in June of 1997. Early reviews were quite shining, with many coaster enthusiasts raving over the ride's intense and thrilling experience. The return run to the station was especially forceful and continues to be that way to this day. Batman and Robin the Chiller followed shortly after, opening on April 5th, 1998 during a season pass holder preview day prior to the park's official opening day on April 9th. Apparently to improve the Chiller's performance, an additional 32 launch motors were added to the main launch tracks, with each track receiving an extra 4 pairs of limbs. Originally, it looks like the steel structure holding the limbs ended right at the end of the observatory, and the main launch limbs stopped somewhere inside the observatory, as we can't see any of them here. When the Chiller reopened, the steel structure was extended outside the observatory, and so did the main launch's limbs. At the time, the ride even featured a short-lived sound effect that played before each train launched.
3, 2, 1.
Reviews of the Chiller were still very positive, just like when the ride opened for a few days in 1997. Steve Urbanowitz, a longtime coaster enthusiast, called Chiller the most intense amusement ride he had ever experienced. In early May 1998, Great Adventure hosted a second media day for the twin coaster and invited 70 sets of identical and fraternal twins, ranging in age from 4 to 68 to commemorate the coaster. Here's a shot of Dane and Rafferty with his twin brother aboard Robin. At this point, the Chiller was also capable of launching both tracks simultaneously, but that would be short-lived due to electrical issues. More on that later. Early reviews noted the Robin Chiller was the most intense of all the shuttle coasters. Both Mr. Freeze's and the Batman Chiller featured more graceful inverted top hats, whereas the Robin Chiller featured a ferocious cobra roll taken at high speed, delivering sustained positive G-forces through the entire element until the zero-G roll, which didn't consistently rotate. At the approach and exit of the rolls, the rotation was much faster, and in the center of the rolls, the rotation was much slower, making for an ultra disorienting experience. The rolls were even wilder on the return run, since the boost limbs sent trains backwards into the rolls at an even higher speed than on the forward pass. Last but not least, Mr. Freeze at Six Flags St. Louis officially opened to the public on Friday, April 10th, 1998, and early reviews were also glowing, stating the ride was well worth the long wait. With all the shuttle coasters finally in operation after a nearly year-long delay, the $35 million gamble taken by Six Flags was seemingly paying off. Well, maybe it wasn't. While the rides offered an experience unlike anything at the time, they were uncomfortably rough, causing riders to headbang or bash their heads against the over-the-shoulder restraints while maneuvering through the layout. The Flight of Fears suffered the same issue, and its original restraints did not have enough padding. Shortly after opening, additional black padding was wrapped around the upper parts of the restraints near riders' heads to help cushion the blows. Perhaps Phoenix Rides believed the shuttle coasters would be smoother, as when the Chiller opened in 1997, it used the same minimally padded restraints that Flight of Fear first opened with. The two tracks were reportedly so rough that Great Adventure quickly banned riders from wearing earrings while aboard, as earrings mixed with the headbanging could cause riders' ears to bleed. Robin was apparently the roughest of all the shuttle coasters thanks to both its zero-G roll and rapid-paced cobra roll. The Chiller only ran for a few days in 1997 before the park allegedly shut it down to have additional padding added to the restraints. This is why the Chiller was was reportedly already closed before the Texas Mr. Freeze incident occurred on June 10th of that year. While the shuttle coasters were closed during the summer of 1997, coaster enthusiasts were provided a backstage tour of the Missouri Mr. Freeze. The restraints were even seen featuring an iteration of padding the rides never opened with. The additional black padding was just on the insides of the restraint near riders' heads, but for one reason or another, this iteration never made the cut. When the coasters opened in 1998, they featured additional black padding which wrapped around the entirety of the upper shoulder harnesses, just like the padding added to both Flight of Fears. The rough experience was likely due to the combination of rapid transitions in the ride layout, as well as an unideal axle and wheel bogie design which managed to amplify the ride's roughness. Coupled with over-the-shoulder restraints, it guaranteed that riders would experience headbanging. While the new shuttle coasters ran a newer train iteration than the Flight of Fears did, which may have made them lighter, at roughly 7 tons for a 5-car train, the updated train still featured the unideal axle and wheel bogie design of the Flight of Fear trains. This means the left and right wheel bogies are linked by a steel rod, so they are not independent of each other as they are on trains from manufacturers like B&M, Mack, or Intamin. For instance, on rides like Hyperia at Thorpe Park, the left and right bogies operate independently and directly support the car above. With the shuttle coasters, any bump or vibration experienced by a wheel bogie on one side of the track means the wheel bogie on the opposite side is also affected. Unlike independent bogies where bumps or vibrations felt on one side would have less impact on the other side. Additionally, the linked bogies support each ride vehicle at the center, rather than each wheel bogie directly supporting the car above it. While the track of the shuttle coasters appears smooth and properly heartlined just like it does on Flight of Fear, some transitions cause the trains to rock side to side instead of staying stable. Another factor contributing to the roughness is that each car of the shuttle coasters has 2 axles rather than 1. Most modern steel coasters use trailer trains, where the front car has 2 axles, but every trailing car has only a rear axle. The front of each trailing car is supported by the rear axle of the car ahead, as seen on Storm Runner at Hershey Park. Even Aero Development manufactured coasters with trailer trains as far back as 1975 with Corkscrew at Knott's Berry Farm. Phoenix Ride's method of using 2 axles per car may have aimed to distribute forces more evenly across a larger fleet of wheels, but as a side effect, the additional axles as well as linking the left and right bogies likely enhanced the effect of side-to-side shaking and increased the ride's roughness. In 2001, Flight of Fear's over-the-shoulder restraints were upgraded to lap bars. This eliminated all headbanging, providing for a much more comfortable experience. Thankfully, Six Flags worked with Phoenix Rides, who at this point had become the premier rides we know today, to implement the same change with their shuttle coasters. The Robin Chiller was upgraded first, likely because it was the roughest of all the shuttle coasters. In 2001, both Mr. Freeze's and the Batman Chiller operated with over-the-shoulder restraints, while the Robin Chiller remained closed nearly that entire season with its train nowhere in sight. Around August 30th, the Robin train returned to the ride's maintenance track with freshly installed lap bars, allowing it to reopen on September 8th, 2001 with a significantly more comfortable experience. Following Robin, the Batman Chiller and Mr. Freeze's had their over-the-shoulder restraints replaced with lap bars for the 2002 season, which finally eliminated the issue of roughness in all the shuttle coasters, and it's thankfully how the Mr. Freeze's continue to operate today. However, another issue still existed with the shuttle coasters. Most roller coasters begin with a lift hill and climb to a height that provide trains with ample energy to complete the ride circuit. With most launching roller coasters, directly after a launch is the tallest hill of the ride or the tallest hill of that ride segment, such as the top hat on Velocicoaster at Islands of Adventure. As long as the train rides over this high point, it will gain enough energy from the following drop to complete the remainder of the layout, or at least that ride segment. For whatever reason, Phoenix Rides adopted a more extreme design style and built both Flight of Fear so the Cobra Roll following the launch is not the ride's tallest point. Instead, the high point is 5 elements into the ride. This little bump here, which follows the ride's third inversion and an upward helix. So even if a train launches fast enough to clear the first 3 inversions, it can still valley on the ascents of the following helix or between the helix and the little hump. Due to this issue, Kings Island and Kings Dominion both installed catwalks catwalks in the ride's primary valley locations following the third inversion. Well, even after witnessing the outcome of their extreme design choice, Phoenix Rides applied the same radical approach to the shuttle coasters. This method was most aggressively seen on the Robin Chiller. On Robin, the boost limbs began at a height that was taller than the 105-foot tall Cobra Roll, meaning the boost limbs were the ride's high point. This likely meant that in a situation where a train launched only fast enough to barely ride over both ends of the Cobra Roll, the train would ride up the 0G roll and stall before reaching the boost limbs. Thus, the train would roll down the incline towards the Cobra Roll without the needed boost to complete the return trip. The Batman Chiller appeared to have a more optimal design due to its taller top hat. The boost limbs began at the same height as Robin's, but the 139-foot tall top hat was taller than the start of the boost limbs, making the top hat the ride's high point. So in a situation where a train launched only fast enough to barely ride over the top hat, it would still gain enough energy to ride up to the boost limbs, allowing the train to receive the extra speed needed to complete the return run. This is reason number 1, Robin was more problematic than Batman. Keep note of that for later in the video. The same is true with the Mr. Freezes, as the boost limbs begin at a lower height than the 150-foot tall top hat. Even with an overbanked turn in between the top hat and vertical spike, as long as the train crests the top hat, it will gain enough energy to ride through the overbanked turn and climb up to the boost limbs, allowing the train to make the return run back to the station. On the Mr. Freezes, trains can valley between the top hat and overbanked turn, as well as between the overbanked turn and vertical spike. On the Batman Chiller, trains could valley between the top hat and 0G roll, but due to another design flaw, trains could also valley high in the air between the 0G roll and 45-degree incline, since a dip existed between the rolls and inclines. Had the rolls maintained an upward angle into the inclines, gravity would always bring trains back to the base of the top hat. Robin could also valley in these same two locations, as well as in the middle of the Cobra Roll, since both ends were the same height. With 3 valley locations, of all the shuttle coasters, Robin was the most susceptible to valleying, as all the other rides had 2 locations. This is reason number 2 Robin was more problematic than Batman. When the Chiller briefly opened in 1997, it did not feature catwalks in its valley-prone locations. It certainly did not on Robin's Cobra Roll. The Texas Mr. Freeze also did not originally feature catwalks, but prior to opening in 1998, catwalks were added in the ride's 2 low zones to aid in evacuating riders from a stalled train and craning trains from the track. It appears the Chiller reopened in 1998 with a platform between the main inversions and 0G rolls, and a catwalk in the middle of Robin's Cobra Roll. Interestingly, the original catwalk in the Cobra Roll was rather short. It was only in the center of the Cobra Roll and only accounted for maybe 1 car length of the 5-car train. Then later in the 1998 season, the catwalk was extended to account for the full length of a train. For whatever reason, a platform between the 0G rolls and 45-degree inclines wasn't added until years later. This shot is from 2002 or even as late as 2003, and you'll notice there's no catwalk present between the 0G rolls and 45-degree inclines. Later in the video, we'll discuss the likely reason why this catwalk was added so many years after the ride had already opened. The Missouri Mr. Freeze never received any catwalks in its low points, and a mobile set of stairs is used to assist with evacuating stalled trains. Compared to the Texas Mr. Freeze, the Missouri Mr. Freeze is built closer to ground level, since the Texas Mr. Freeze sits on top of the park's train ride, as well as the mini mine train coaster. With newer LSM launching coasters, most launches occur at a low point or at least begin at a low point. In coasters that feature more than one launch, also known as multi-launch coasters, this is especially important. Copperhead Strike at Carowinds or Voltron Nevera at Europa Park are great examples, and it's common for trains to stop at a launch mid-ride rather than receiving a boost to complete the circuit. Since launches are placed at low points, trains stop within the launch track. Once it's okay for a train to continue through the circuit, the control system executes the launch, usually with multiple forward and backward passes, also known as a swing launch, which sends the train through the rest of the layout. The Flash Vertical Velocity is another great example. It's also a launching shuttle coaster, but features LSMs in every single low point of the attraction. So if a train doesn't have enough speed to ride over a hill, or a launch fails to engage, the train will stop in a low point within a launch zone. The control system can then accelerate the stopped train back to speed with the swing launch, allowing the train to complete the layout once it gains enough speed to climb over the next hill. Phoenix's shuttle coasters are technically multi-launch coasters, but with the boost limbs placed well over 100 feet in the air, the rides have no ability to self-rescue a stalled train. Any stalled train must be craned off the track and reassembled on the ride's maintenance track. For the Mr. Freezes, I previously believed a winch and boom at the peak of the vertical spikes was used to winch trains that had valleyed between the spike and overbank turn. Once winched to the top, the train would be released and complete the circuit. But it turns out this boom and winch are part of a spider basket system used only to perform inspections and maintenance of the boost limbs. Any valley train on the Mr. Freezes can only be rescued by craning it off the track. Funny enough, in 2011, Premier built another shuttle coaster powered by LSMs, and it's like a miniature version of Mr. Freeze. It's currently named Racing Coaster and is located at Trans Studio Bandung in Indonesia, yet the ride still features the same crazy design language where the boost LSMs needed for trains to gain enough speed to complete the circuit in reverse are mounted high up a nearly vertical spike. So just like the original shuttle coasters, if a situation arises where the boost LSMs do not engage, the ride has no ability to self-rescue a valley train. So once a train valleys, it will need to be craned off the tracks in order to get the ride operating again. Perhaps if the boost limbs on the shuttle coasters were situated in the ride's low points, that would have allowed the ride to self-rescue valley trains. But even this is tricky, and the placement of the boost limbs high in the air might actually make sense. Newer LSMs can be placed on non-linear tracks such as an airtime hill, but the generation of limbs used on the shuttle coasters must be mounted on completely straight sections of track. So in order to place boost limbs on the ride's low points, it would have required segments of straight track between each ride element to have been part of the original design. The Mr. Freeze coasters would need straight track between the top hat and overbank turn, as well as between the overbank turn and vertical spike. The chillers would have needed straight track between the main inversions and zero-G rolls. And ideally, the zero-G rolls would have featured an upward slope into the inclines. Then our hypothetical boost limbs could be mounted in the straight track between each ride element. The limbs can produce forward or backward launches by changing their polarity, so the limbs would provide a forward boost on the outbound lap, and then a backward boost on the return leg, just like the LSMs do on flash vertical velocity. Then if a train ever valleyed, it would stop within the boost limbs due to them being in a low point, allowing the control system to execute a swing launch by reversing the polarity of the limbs. Once the train gained enough speed through forward and backward launches, it would ride up and over the next ride element. As much as this makes sense on paper, executing this was likely difficult because the shuttle coasters do not use just one type of limb. The Mr. Freezes use 5 different limbs. They're labeled A, B, C, D, and F limbs, and each is built for a specific use case. The chiller likely used these 5 limb types as well. Here is an F limb at the end of its launch. The different limbs vary in the amount of copper windings inside them, making them better suited for low, medium, and high speed, as well as high, medium, and low thrust levels. The limbs also vary in size, with A, B, and C motors being 42 inches long, D motors are 61 inches long, and F motors are 71 inches long. On the Mr. Freezes, the main launch begins with 2 pairs of A motors, then 3 pairs of B motors, then 8 pairs of C motors, then 15 pairs of D motors, and lastly 16 pairs of F motors, making for a total of 44 pairs of motors. The A, B, and C motors have electrical windings inside wound for high current and low speed to provide the highest thrust for slow-moving trains. Between A, B, and C motors, A motors are tuned for the lowest speed and C motors are tuned for the highest speed, which is why they're at the start of the launch in the order they are, as their function is to get a stop train moving. The D and F motors are wound for higher speed and lower current, so they're best for accelerating an already fast-moving train, which is why they're placed later in the launch. F motors are wound for the highest speed, and D motors are wound for a slightly lower speed, hence why D motors are placed before the F motors. The limbs on the vertical spike consist of A and B motors, starting with 4 pairs of B motors, then 6 pairs of A motors, with the boost occurring high up a 90-degree incline. The slow-riding trains require maximum thrust as gravity's acceleration back to ground is the strongest at a 90-degree angle. A and B motors are best suited to provide the greatest thrust for a slow-moving train, making them perfect for their use on the boost. Placing B motors before A motors makes sense since B motors are tuned for a slightly higher speed than A motors, and trains travel upwards while entering the boost, meaning B motors catch the train as it continues to slow down, then A motors provide the strongest thrust to push the slow riding train upwards against the strong pull of gravity. The chiller likely used A and B motors on its boost for the same reason. However, with the chiller's incline only at 45 degrees, gravity's acceleration would have been much less, which is probably why each track had just 7 pairs of limbs spaced further apart instead of 10 pairs of limbs placed more densely together like on the Mr. Freezes. On Mr. Freeze, the boost limbs have the optional ability to provide a reverse thrust as trains drop back to ground. Previously, I believe the boost limbs always gave a reverse thrust, but it turns out the reverse thrust is almost never used. From what I understand, the reverse thrust is meant to assist slower moving trains in colder weather, but surprisingly, it's actually not very effective. I'd wager that since the acceleration of gravity at a 90-degree angle is so rapid, during the descent down the spike, trains ride too quickly through the A and B motors, making these limbs ineffective since they're meant to provide thrust for slow riding trains. For the chiller, I know reverse thrust on its boost were certainly possible, and from what I hear, this option was always used on the Batman track, but I cannot confirm if Robin also utilized it. At a 45-degree incline, gravity's acceleration is weaker, so trains would not have gained as much speed within the boost limbs, so the boost limbs may have been marginally more effective at providing a reverse thrust. Something else I find interesting is while the Mr. Freezes are advertised to reach a top speed of 70 miles per hour on their main launches, I think their real top speed is actually faster, whereas the chiller's advertised top speed of 65 miles per hour achieved on its main launches made more sense. The Mr. Freezes have a large overbank turn between their vertical spikes and top hats, whereas the 0G rolls of the chiller were more so part of the 45-degree incline and not really a separate hill. When you consider that Mr. Freeze requires a 70 mile per hour launch to ride over its 150-foot tall top hat, it means that on the return trip, trains need to re-enter the top hat at 70 miles per hour. For that to happen, trains need to re-enter the overbank turn faster than 70 miles per hour, since energy is lost as trains traverse the element. Thus, Mr. Freeze should travel faster than 70 miles per hour at the base of its vertical spike on the return run, and that would be its real top speed. Whereas on the chiller, there was no tall ride element between the incline and main inversions like on the Mr. Freezes, as the 0G rolls acted more as a double down. Thus, there wasn't as much energy lost on the outbound and return runs, so trains only needed a top speed of 65 miles per hour on the return trip, the same as the ride's main launch. Another interesting factor is because of the tall overbank turn on Mr. Freeze, trains should lose more speed on the outbound run as they travel towards the boost limbs compared to the chiller. Thus, along with the boost limbs on Mr. Freeze having to overpower the stronger acceleration of gravity at a 90-degree angle, they likely boost the train even higher than the chiller's boost did to make up for the additional energy lost on the outbound and return runs. Anyway, now that we have a greater understanding of the different limbs and what conditions they're best suited for, here's why placing boost limbs in the ride's low points may have not been optimal. Since trains ride through the valleys at high speeds, F motors are best suited since they're wound for the highest speed. But when the boost limbs need to relaunch a stalled train, F motors are the worst equipped to get a stopped train moving again. If we replace the F motors with A, B, and C motors, these motors are best suited to get a stopped train moving again, but not to the speed needed to complete the layout. And during normal operations where trains fly through the low points at high speed, A, B, and C motors would be ineffective, which would cause the train to valley. Then with boost limbs in the low points, reactor plates would be sitting within the limbs, making craning trains off the track extremely difficult. A workaround would be featuring a mix of all the limb types in each valley, but this isn't optimal either, as it means extending the launch segments to fit a few of each limb type. Then nearly 100% of the time, most of the limbs would not be used. During regular operation, only F motors would be used to boost the already fast moving trains, while any of the other motors would not provide any propulsion. Then in the rare instances where a train valleys, only then would the other motors be used to get a stopped train rolling again. Thus, at the time, I don't think it made sense to place boost launches in the low points of the coaster, due to the technical limitations of this limb generation. If the limbs were all the same and capable of all use cases, it would be a different story. So in a crazy way, the placement of the boost limbs so high in the air makes sense, since A and B motors are used in a scenario that best suits their capabilities. And when a train does valley, it means the boost limbs are out of the way, making it much easier to crane the train off the track. Interestingly, Premier built another limb launching shuttle coaster in 2000 named Speed the Ride. It also featured a vertical spike like the Mr. Freezes where trains reverse directions, but its boost launch was located at ground level following a vertical loop. The ride ride also began with a slower launch of 45 miles per hour, but the boost launch delivered the ride's top speed of 70 miles per hour. With the boost launch occurring at ground level, you would think that if a train ever valleyed, the ride could self-rescue the stopped train, but Premier still incorporated their radical hill heights into the attraction, so trains still valleyed in locations outside the boost limbs, making for a rather difficult recovery. Thankfully, Phoenix Rides incorporated a hack into the shuttle coasters to ease the pain of craning away stalled trains. In most of the low zones, removable rail pieces were manufactured into the track. Here's the Missouri Mr. Freeze with its removable rail piece taken off. Note the strongback or center spine of the track is still present, but the running rails are missing across 3 of the cross ties. This allows each car to be craned from the tracks without removing the upstop wheels, which are the wheels that ride below the rails. In this picture, a stalled train on the Robin Chiller is being craned away with its upstop wheels still in place, and a gap in the running rails can be seen here. With the removable rail pieces in place, they look like this. There are 4 triangular steel plates extending from the piece to the cross ties that are fixed to the main track. The steel plates are bolted to the fixed cross ties to secure the removable rail piece, just as the rails of each track piece are secured to the rails of the next piece. Then the upper half of the cross ties in the center of the removable rail piece is bolted to the fixed section of the cross tie below it. Removing these bolts allows for the piece to be easily taken off. On the Mr. Freezes, a magic track piece is featured in both locations where trains are prone to valleying, making it much easier to recover a train after it stalls. However, the story was not the same at the Chiller. Each track of the Chiller had a removable rail piece between the main inversions and zero-G rolls, and the Robin track had a removable rail piece in the center of its Cobra roll. We can even see this piece in Robin's Cobra roll when the ride briefly opened in 1997, before a catwalk was even built in this location, suggesting the rides were originally manufactured with these removable pieces. However, a removable rail piece was not between the zero-G roll and 45-degree incline on both tracks, making it much more problematic to recover stalled trains from this location. We'll touch more on this shortly. Something else I find interesting is the Flight of Fears have a set of launch abort brakes directly after the launch. As we've discussed, most launching roller coasters have their tallest hill following a launch, which guarantees that if a train rides over the tall point, it will complete the circuit. But the Flight of Fears and shuttle coasters were not designed that way. On Flight of Fear, the launch abort brakes prevent trains from entering the layout for many reasons. Say if an emergency stop button or e-stop is pressed, or to prevent a valley if a train was not launched fast enough. Interestingly, the Flight of Fears feature no brakes along the actual launch track, whereas the shuttle coasters only feature brakes during the launch track and not after it. Because of the placement along the launch track, as well as how slowly the magnetic brakes take to raise into the set position, attempting to abort a launch as trains reach top speed may not be effective. Even with the limbs deactivated, the slow-moving magnetic brakes may miss slowing the train entirely. If the launch were aborted by an e-stop or an e-stop fault, all the limbs will shut down, including the boost limbs. Thus, if the train isn't slowed enough and still rides over the first inversion, it will not complete the circuit like a normal launching coaster would. It will ride up to the boost limbs and receive no boost. Chiller's Robin track was likely the worst offender of this issue. With the tall height of the inverted top hats, trains rode more slowly over the crests of these inversions, making it more likely an aborted launch would cause the train to roll back. With Robin's Cobra roll being much lower in height, an aborted launch was less likely to slow a train enough to roll back. And at that point, because Robin's tall point was actually the boost limbs and not the Cobra roll, if the train did not carry enough speed through the Cobra roll, it was guaranteed to valley no matter what, as even if the boost limbs were still functional, it wasn't guaranteed the train would ride through both ends of the Cobra roll, or have enough speed to ride up to the boost limbs to receive its boost. And then if the boost limbs were disabled, forget about it. The train was going to valley. This is reason number 3, Robin was more problematic than Batman. Keep note of that for later in the video. Thankfully, as crazy as the shuttle coasters may seem, the Mr. Freezes are extremely reliable at returning trains back to the station. Each Mr. Freeze is successfully cycled thousands upon thousands of times a year. Then each of the coasters may only valley once or twice per year. Sometimes they even go entire operating years without valleying once. So it's fair to say the rides have nearly a 100% success rate at returning trains to the station. From what I gather, ride operators are trained to only use the e-stop when absolutely necessary to better ensure trains make it back home. And while we're on the subject of launch aborts, the shuttle coasters also have a warm-up mode where trains are purposely launched at a slower speed and only climb halfway up the first first inversion. Depending on the weather, maintenance will perform a certain number of warm-up launches to properly warm up each train's wheels to decrease the likelihood of a valley. The shuttle coasters use a different system than the Flight of Fears to track the position of trains in the launches. Flight of Fear uses a single infrared laser beam mounted behind the station. Depending on how long the laser takes to reflect off the train and return to the receiver, determines which limbs the launch control system activates to continue accelerating the train down the track. This same system is used for the low-powered limbs in the ride's brake run and unload station. This works well on the Flight of Fear since the rides are entirely indoors, but may not be the best for outdoors, as something like a bird flying into the path of a long-running laser beam would abort a launch. Thus, this application wouldn't be the best for the outdoor shuttle coasters, especially on the elevated boost launches. Instead, the shuttle coasters use a mix of proximity sensors and photo eyes to record the location of trains through the launch tracks. On the Mr. Freezes, mounted to the sides of the launch tunnel are photo eyes, which emit infrared lasers across the launch tunnel. As the individual cars interrupt the lasers, the ride control system is able to determine where the train is. Mounted to the launch track are proximity sensors as well as photo eyes. Through most of the launch are proximity sensors which record the friction brakes mounted beneath each car. Towards the end of the launch, these proximity sensors switch to photo eyes, and the friction brakes trip the small laser beams instead. Then for the boost limbs, only proximity sensors mounted to the track are used. Overall, the system is quite reliable and works by turning on or off different clusters of limbs depending on the train's location. This may not be the most energy efficient, but the reliability of the system aids greatly in the ride's high success rate of returning trains to the station. So far, I've mentioned that pressing an e-stop or an e-stop fault occurring at the wrong time can cause a train to valley. The ride losing power mid-cycle can also cause a valley as the boost limbs will not function. A third cause is any situation where the control system believes it's unsafe to return the train to the station. Perhaps if a train approaches the boost limbs too quickly, the boost limbs may not activate to avoid sending the train too high up the incline towards the bumper. But not all overspeed faults will cause the boost limbs to deactivate. On the I've heard of overspeed faults occurring where the control system still fired the boost limbs and returned the train towards the station. But in these instances, the control system would stop the train in the friction brakes before the station, rather than allowing the train to properly park in the station. Surprisingly, these brakes on the shuttle coasters are part of a quote-unquote block zone system. For those of you who are unfamiliar, a block zone is a section of ride that only one train may occupy. At the end of a block zone is a method to stop a train in case the block zone ahead is still occupied. This is the safety system that prevents roller coaster trains from colliding into one another. Starting with the chiller, these were the ride's quote-unquote block zones. First was the station area, then the launch area, then the free running area, and lastly the boost area. Thus, both tracks had 4 alleged block zones that allowed each track to run just one train. The Mr. Freezes feature the same quote-unquote block zones, but instead of a single station, there's a Station A zone and Station B zone because of the dual station tracks. Now, as my air quotes may have indicated, these aren't true block zones and are better classified as ride areas, as not all of the zones can stop a train. Only the station and launch track can properly stop trains because they feature friction brakes. Within the sloped boost area, there is no way to stop a train. Technically, trains can be stopped in the free running area by valleying the train, but that doesn't count. Interestingly, each of these ride areas has to be cleared as part of the daily startup procedure. The same for roller coasters with real block systems. Mr. Freeze was advertised with a theoretical capacity of 1,300 riders per hour. 1,300 riders divided by 20 riders per train is 65 launches an hour, which is a launch every 55 seconds. It takes 55 seconds from the start of each launch to when the train stops following the ride cycle. However, the ride can't launch a train every 55 seconds, as additional time is required for the station tables to position the next train. To speed up operations, Mr. Freeze has multi-move with its 2 station tables, meaning both tables can move at the same time, which greatly reduces the time between each launch. However, I hear that in recent years, ride crews have been instructed to only move one station track at a time to improve the ride's reliability. Thus, in reality, Mr. Freeze has a theoretical capacity of 900 riders per hour. It requires 45 launches an hour with a launch every 80 seconds. Even without multi-move, this is still a pretty high capacity. The chiller's theoretical capacity was advertised at a slightly higher 1,600 riders per hour, with each track capable of 800 riders per hour. This was due in part to the chiller having a shorter ride cycle than Mr. Freeze, and not having to wait on station tables to slide in and out of position. With 20 riders per train, it meant each track needed to launch 40 times an hour, which equated to a launch every 90 seconds. It was assumed each track took 45 seconds to cycle and thus had 45 seconds to load the next train. From what I hear, at each track, a good ride crew could do about 600 riders per hour, and the best ride crews could do over 700 riders per hour. The chiller's advertised theoretical capacity was due to its original ability to launch both tracks simultaneously, meaning each track could be launched at any point without waiting on the other track to complete its launch first. Just like both Flight of Fears, the launches of all the shuttle coasters, including the boost launches, were powered directly by the electrical grid, as opposed to most newer launching roller coasters where on-site electrical storage systems supply most of the energy needed for each launch. For instance, Red Force at Ferrariland uses a supercapacitor system to supply 3 megawatts of power for each launch, while the electrical grid supplies 1 megawatt. In my Flight of Fear video, I detailed how the ride is powered by a 12.47 kilovolt or kV feeder line from the electrical grid that powers a 2.5 megavolt amp or MVA transformer solely for Flight of Fear. The transformer steps down the voltage to 3-phase power at 480 volts, which is then routed to the ride via a transformer secondary. One 2.5 megavolt amp transformer is sufficient for Flight of Fear, since the average current required during each launch is 3000 amps. At 480 volt 3-phase powered, 3000 amps is all a 2.5 megavolt amp transformer can supply. However, it should be noted that the transformer can briefly spike above an output of 3000 amps, which explains how it powers the first 1 second of the launch, which requires over 4000 amps. But this brief spike can only be sustained for a very short amount of time. The more powerful launches on both Mr. Freeze's and the chiller require 5000 amps sustained for 3 seconds, so a single 2.5 megavolt amp transformer is not enough. Looking at the electrical setup of the Texas Mr. Freeze, we'll see two 2.5 megavolt amp transformers highlighted here. Combined, they are able to supply the ride 6000 amps. Each transformer is likely powered by a dedicated 12.47 kV feeder line, so on our electrical supply diagram, we'll place 2 feeder lines and 2 transformers. The 2 transformers likely work in parallel, with each supplying 2500 of the 5000 amps needed for each launch. It would make sense the same setup is used at the Missouri Mr. Freeze, as well as at each track of the chiller when it still existed. However, since the chiller had 2 tracks and each track likely needed 2 2.5 MVA transformers, the ride likely had a total of 4 dedicated feeder lines and 4 transformers able to supply the ride a total of 12,000 amps. Expanding on my Flight of Fear video, the chiller's power technically wasn't directly from the electrical grid, but instead an electrical substation built specifically for Great Adventure. In our power supply diagram, I'll place the substation in between the grid and what I'll now call distribution lines that powered the chiller's 4 transformers. Most major amusement parks have their own substations due to the sheer amount of electricity they require, as not only do all the rides and attractions require electricity, but so do any restaurants, park lighting, pumps for water rides, shops, entertainment stages, HVAC systems, and so much more. Substations also help manage sudden power surges required for rides like the chiller. They provide reliable and cost-efficient power distribution throughout a park and ensure scalability for future expansions. This looks to be Great Adventure's substation. It's deep in the woods behind Nitro, close to County Road 537. A large number of overhead distribution lines from Jersey Central Power and Light, or JCPL, feed power to the substation. They are supported by wooden poles, an indication that this power is at the distribution level, which is medium voltage. That's typically 12.47 or 13.8 kV, sometimes as high as 34.5 kV, whereas high voltage transmission lines are strung on much taller steel supports and transmit electricity across much longer distances at voltages ranging from 69 to 500 kV. Great Adventure's substation looks to be fed by multiple medium voltage distribution lines, as opposed to a single high voltage transmission line. While multiple medium voltage lines are well suited to handle the park's electrical needs. We'll discuss shortly why a single high-voltage transmission line may have been better suited for the high electrical demands of the chiller. Great Adventure's substation will step that down to a more typical medium voltage of 12.47 kV, and then distribute this power around the park. Or if the incoming voltage is already 12.47 kV, the park substation will redistribute electricity at the same voltage to different areas of the park. Once a distribution line reaches its intended park area, a transformer in that location steps down the voltage from 12.47 kV to what would be considered a low voltage like 480, 240, or 120 volts. This low voltage electricity powers rides, restaurants, shops, and other facilities in the area. Typically, all of these use cases in the same park area will share power from a single distribution line. However, as we've discussed, the insane power required for electromagnetic launch coasters like the Chiller necessitate that these rides have dedicated transmission lines. As I just discussed, the Chiller likely had 4 transmission lines that powered the ride's 4 transformers. This was meant to allow both tracks to launch simultaneously even if electricity came from the same substation. While this worked for the few days the ride ran in 1997, along with part of the 1998 season, it was ultimately deemed unfeasible. Like the Flight of Fears, the instantaneous and high power demand from the launches overburdened the transformers and created voltage sags. Voltage sags are dips in the voltage level of an electrical system caused by sudden and high current draws. If you ever notice your lights dim at home when turning on the air conditioner, that's a voltage sag caused by the high current draw of the appliance. As the Chiller launched a train, the sudden demand of 5,000 amps from each track would overburden the transformers, causing the voltage being supplied to the ride to dip below 480 volts. To ensure the train got up to proper speed, the launch system would draw even more current to compensate for the drop in voltage. This led to further problems as the distribution lines powering the transformers also saw their electricity degraded. This continued to degrade the electricity in the park's substation, thus degrading the power being supplied to other areas of the park and even nearby customers on the electrical grid, just as Flight of Fear did at Kings Island. Depending on the severity, voltage sags can be incredibly disruptive to theme park operations and can cause important electronics like programmable logic controllers or PLCs and other computer systems to momentarily shut down. This can cause attractions to stop mid-cycle, leaving riders stranded high in the air. The Chiller was also affected by the voltage sags it created, and the ride control system would often receive warning or trouble lights related to the power issues. Whenever this occurred, the ride was shut down until a mechanic was able to investigate and correct the issue. If the ride was operating, the severity of a voltage sag could even fault the ride, which may have disabled the boost limbs. If a train was cycling the track and hadn't passed through the additional limbs, then it would absolutely valley. From what I gather, the same approach used to fix voltage sags created by Flight of Fear at Kings Island was used for the Chiller, and that is supercapacitors were added to the ride's electrical supply system. Supercapacitors have the ability to charge and discharge rapidly, over and over again, making them ideal for providing quick support to the launch system. The Texas Mr. Freeze uses supercapacitors also, and they are located in the 3 cabinets highlighted here. It's likely safe to assume the Missouri Mr. Freeze uses supercapacitors as well. I would imagine the supercapacitors at the shuttle coasters function just like they do at Flight of Fear. This means the supercapacitors do not power the launch system itself, and instead supply instantaneous reactive power, which is essential for maintaining stable voltage levels so that active power can efficiently drive the limbs. In simple terms, active power is what actually powers the launch, while reactive power regulates the voltage to ensure everything runs smoothly. By regulating the voltage of the launch with reactive power, it meant the voltage of the system remained at 480 volts, which negated the domino effect that degraded the power quality in the park substation, other park areas, and for other nearby customers on the grid. But even with supercapacitors equipped at the Chiller, it appears further efforts were taken to limit any voltage sags, likely because of the ride's 2 tracks. Even if voltage sags did not occur in the individual power supplies of each ride, the sudden demand of power to launch both trains could still degrade the power quality in the park substation, which then led to the domino effect that degraded the power quality in the rest of the park and surrounding area. Thus, sometime during the 1998 season, the PLCs on both tracks were interlocked, and the launches became staggered. If Batman had already launched, the PLC prevented Robin from launching until Batman reached the boost area. Then Robin could launch, or vice versa. The train on the course needed to reach the boost area before the next train could launch. Note that in this example, Robin launched before Batman completed its boost up the 45-degree incline, and this allowed for trains to travel through the main inversions at the same time, just in different directions. We'll touch on this more in depth shortly. Now, had Great Adventure's substation been powered by a single high-voltage transmission line, the higher power level may have better supported simultaneous launches at the chiller, but it's much more expensive to route high-voltage transmission lines, so unfortunately it seems the park had to deal with the limitations of its electrical system the best they could, without spending a ridiculous amount of money. So in this case, the park stopped simultaneous launches of the chiller to better improve the reliability of the park's electrical system. An alternate story suggests that one of the Mr. Freezes blew a transformer sometime in 1998 to get the ride reopened as quickly as possible. As the ride had already opened nearly a year late, one of the chiller's transformers was shipped to that Mr. Freeze. This likely would have limited the chiller to 3 distribution lines and 3 transformers, meaning only 9,000 amps were available to power the ride instead of the previous 12,000 amps. The ride required 10,000 amps to launch both trains at the same time, so simultaneous launches from the station would have become impossible. And while 9,000 amps may have been plenty to support the operation of one track at a time, further evidence suggests the ride held on to all its transformers. For one, reducing both tracks to a total of 3 transformers would have placed additional strain on each transformer, potentially causing more voltage sags even if trains were launched in a staggered fashion. With 4 transformers, each one would have needed to yield less amperage during each launch, as well as have more time to recover between launches, ensuring consistent performance with back-to-back launches even during the hot summer months. 4 distribution lines would have also placed less strain on the park substation as opposed to 3 lines. The use of 3 transformers would have also required for the electrical supplies of both rides to be combined, since each track would have required 2 out of the 3 transformers to operate, whereas ideally it would have been better to keep the electrical supplies of both tracks separated. Then when you consider that with staggered launches, one track could still execute its main launch while the other track did its boost launch, the math just doesn't seem to add up to support only 3 transformers. As I discussed earlier, the boost limbs probably powered with the full 5,000 amps just like the main launch, as a lot of thrust was needed to accelerate the trains upward against the downward acceleration of gravity. With one track executing its main launch while the other did its boost launch, it meant 10,000 amps were required, which exceeded the 9,000 amps 3 transformers would have provided. While it may have been possible for the transformers to quickly exceed their maximum amperage, which seems to be the case at the Flight of Fears, the back-to-back launches of 2 tracks with 2 launches each would have quickly degraded the overall power quality with a limited number of transformers. And with the power issues the ride had already faced, I don't think it makes sense to then limit the chiller's electrical supply. Interestingly, the Mr. Freezes still continue to face power issues even if they're just a single track. At Six Flags St. Louis, Mr. Freeze cannot launch at the same time the water pumps for the neighboring Thunder River Rapids ride are first started. Both applications require an immense and sudden current load. And even with Mr. Freeze being on its own distribution line from the park substation, the high current draw of both the pumps starting and Mr. Freeze launching a train can supposedly cause a park-wide power outage. So whenever the pumps are first started at Thunder River, the park's maintenance team takes extra precaution to make sure Mr. Freeze does not launch a train simultaneously. At Six Flags Over Texas, the local electric grid is often overburdened due to the heavy use of air conditioning during the hot summer months. On these hot summer days, Mr. Freeze is lucky if its launch is powered with 450 volts rather than the intended 480 volts. When this occurs, the ride can display a train speed marginal warning light on the operating panel, indicating the ride may be launching more slowly than desired. And if the voltage continues to drop, the ride will eventually fault. Thankfully, even with limited voltage, the ride still manages to get trains up to proper speed on the main launch, as even with the train speed marginal warning, there's still a good amount of wiggle room before the ride is truly launching too slowly. As a further precaution when voltage is limited, Six Flags Over Texas will lighten the load on the launch system by not loading 2 of the 5 cars on each train. And with less stress placed on the limbs, it reduces the chances that they'll overheat on a hot summer day. Another issue at Six Flags Over Texas has been the addition of Aquaman Power Wave, which is an LSM launching water coaster built by Mack Rides. From what I understand, Aquaman likely pulls its power directly from the park substation, just like Mr. Freeze, as Mack launching coasters typically do not use electrical storage systems. Allegedly, since Aquaman opened, it's even more common for Mr. Freeze to receive less than the desired 480 volts for each launch, leading to a higher frequency of train speed marginal warnings. Thankfully, the launch system still manages to get each train up to full speed, even with less voltage being a more common occurrence. But it's interesting that over 2 decades later, the ride still faces power issues that can cause the ride to run at just 3/5 of its intended capacity. Though this time it's due to outside conditions, and perhaps Six Flags Over Texas needs to upgrade its substation if it hasn't already. Or better yet, the state of Texas needs to upgrade its electrical grid. Surprisingly, the most common day-to-day operational issues at the Chiller and Mr. Freeze's is the inconsistent parking of trains in the station following a cycle. Just like Flight of Fear, the shuttle coasters have completely flat launch tracks. Since the shuttle coasters also use their flat launch tracks as the main brake run, the brake system must carefully slow each train, so it carries enough momentum to make it all the way back to the home position in the station. If the brakes remove too much speed, the train will not make it back to the home position and stop too early. The brakes on the station track that park the train must also be exactly precise. Even with limbs present along the entire launch track and in the station, they do not assist with moving trains into the home position during a normal cycle, so the momentum trains carry through the brake run must be enough to still reach the home position in the station. Oftentimes, trains that enter the brake run faster than normal will undershoot because the PLC will brake these trains more aggressively, causing the train to stop just an inch or two short of the true home position, which requires ride mechanics to push the train ever so slightly back into the correct position so that operations can resume. Interestingly, whenever a ride stop occurs that causes a train to stop in the launch block, which is the friction brakes right outside the station, the limbs provide a mini launch to send the train back to the station. However, the limbs still do not assist with actually parking trains in these scenarios. Unfortunately, the Chiller possessed an issue that is thankfully not seen with the Mr. Freezes. On a few occasions, trains have managed to stall within the 0G roll. On August 18, 2004, at about 3:30 p.m., lightning struck an electrical substation nearby Great Adventure, and power was cut to the park. Interestingly, the park's attractions were still operating even with lightning in the vicinity, which is not a normal practice. According to the park spokeswoman, there were no storm clouds or lightning over the park. Otherwise, the park's attractions would have been closed. The power outage occurred at the worst time, with the train on the Robin track navigating the outbound lap before it had reached the boost limbs. With no electricity, the boost limbs were no longer powered, meaning the train would not make the return run. Unfortunately, the conditions were just right so that instead of stalling in one of the ride's valley locations, which would be a low point, the train instead stalled in the 0G roll, 75 feet in the air, leaving 8 riders in cars 4 and 5 fully upside down, and 12 riders in cars 1, 2, and 3 tipped on their sides. It took 40 minutes for park employees to ease the stalled train down to a location where riders could then be safely evacuated. Thankfully, no riders were seriously injured. To get the ride operating again, the stalled train had to be craned from the track, which was a lengthy process, so the Chiller did not reopen that day, whereas other rides affected by the power outage had a much easier time recovering. For instance, a train was cycling Nitro Circuit when the power went out, causing it to stop at the block break after the Helix. From there, riders were easily evacuated using the catwalk and stairs. Once power returned, the train was released from the block break and completed the circuit. Nitro and many other rides were able to reopen that day around 4:30, just an hour after the power went out. The shuttle coasters are unique in that they rely more on electricity rather than gravity for trains to complete the circuit. Then with the 0G rolls of the Chiller not featuring a continuous upward slope into the 45-degree inclines, it meant trains could not only valley between the rolls and inclines, but also stall at the crest of the rolls. I also have a feeling that the conversion from over-the-shoulder restraints to lap bars increased the likelihood for trains to stall upside down in the rolls. Not only did the restraint switch make the trains lighter, but it also brought the train's center of gravity closer to the track, likely making it easier for the trains to stall upside down, as I haven't heard of this issue occurring with the original restraints. The same event happened a year prior on July 25th, 2003. At roughly 6:45 p.m., a train on the Robin track was cycling the circuit. According to the park, the incident was caused by a defective photo eye, which are used to send readings of each train's speed to the ride control control system. The defective photo eye likely read an incorrect speed, that I would guess triggered an overspeed fault, causing the PLC to shut off the boost limbs as a precaution. Without the boost limbs, the train would not make the return run, and like in 2004, rather than stalling in a regular valley location, the train managed to run out of speed while upside down in the zero-G roll. Thankfully, no one was seriously injured, but a child aboard the train unfortunately suffered an asthma attack. Following this incident, both tracks of the chiller remained closed until July 30th, 2003, when they were finally approved to reopen. Referring back to earlier in the video, train stalling upside down in the zero-G rolls was likely one of the reasons a catwalk was finally installed between the zero-G rolls and 45-degree inclines. Interestingly, even after this catwalk was installed, there was still no easy way to access it, as there was never a pair of stairs or even a ladder built to access this platform. From what I understand, a high reach was required to be stationed at the ride in order for it to operate, so I would imagine the high reach was the official method used to reach that catwalk whenever needed. Thankfully, for how complex a ride the Mr. Freezes are, they're actually pretty reliable, even if maintaining the rides is more challenging than your average roller coaster. Unfortunately, the same could not be said for the chiller. Not only was the chiller more prone to valleying as well as stalling upside down, double the tracks meant double the problems, as Great Adventure had to maintain 432 launch stators compared to either Mr. Freeze, which only has 212 each. With 432 stators, it doubled the number that could overheat and swell up or begin smoking, especially the boost limbs. It was actually a pretty common occurrence for the ride's limbs to overheat and begin smoking, such as on May 4th of 2004 when a smoking limb shut down the entire coaster. In the chiller's early years, both tracks were more consistently in operation, suggesting Great Adventure had an easier time managing the ride's limbs. Or if only one track was in operation, the other track was typically functional, but just not staffed with employees to operate. Well, for whatever reason, it became much more of a struggle to keep the chiller fully equipped with all of its limbs in its later years. To get around this, the park would unfortunately close Batman quite often, and move some of its limbs over to Robin so that Robin could continue operating. In this shot, taken in 2003, you'll notice two pairs of limbs missing from Batman's boost. In 2005, Batman did not operate at all, and for most of the season, the track was missing most or even all of its boost limbs. Ironically, the chiller was repainted in 2005, less than a decade after it opened, which saw the Batman track painted black instead of its original dark blue. Yet the park could pay to repaint the ride too early, but not keep the ride equipped with the necessary number of limbs to keep both tracks operating. Because of Batman's seldom operations, it grew a reputation for being more problematic than Robin, but it was truly the opposite. Robin only became the default track since it was believed to be less likely to valley due to its shorter Cobra roll. But as we discussed earlier in the video, I believe there were several reasons why Batman was actually less susceptible to valleying. At first, the park maintained a full 7 pairs of limbs on Robin's boost as they took limbs from Batman, but in later years they realized another benefit to running Robin over Batman, and that was because of its shorter Cobra roll. It needed as little as 3 pairs of boost limbs to complete the return trip, whereas Batman required the full 7 pairs. However, as I'll get into next, I truly believe the park would have had an easier time with Chiller if they had made Batman the default track instead. And that's because a severe issue with Robin ultimately shut down the chiller for good. On June 3rd, 2006, at approximately 12:15 p.m., Robin was operating with riders. As a train was traversing the forward pass and exiting the Cobra roll into the zero-G roll, the bottom half of a wheel bogie on Car 3 broke off. Thus, Car 3 was now out of alignment, causing its reactor plates to collide with the boost limbs. The train then rode back down the incline, with Car 3 grinding against the track as it damaged a great deal of cross ties in the zero-G roll and lower valley. As you would imagine, the train valleyed between the zero-G roll and Cobra roll. All riders were evacuated in less than 15 minutes, and thankfully no one was seriously injured. Here we see the train shortly afterwards, and Car 3 can be seen sitting out of alignment with the rest of the train. It turns out Robin had an issue with cracking wheel bogies, and the wheel bogies used at the time of the 2006 accident were a second generation bogie that were implemented to alleviate any cracking. However, I believe this is the first time a wheel bogie had completely broken on the chiller. Ironically, on the day of the accident, accident, the ride crew requested to begin the day operating Batman, but maintenance instead handed them Robin. Following the accident, both tracks remained closed for the rest of the season, which was a shame as not only had El Toro just made its grand opening, but Batman had just reopened after being closed all of 2005, which means the park just narrowly missed a perfect window where it would have had an absolutely killer coaster lineup, which at the time would have included King Ka, El Toro, Great American Scream Machine, Nitro, and both tracks of Batman and Robin the Chiller. If only we had all of those options today. The tight zero-G rolls were blamed for the accident, as it was believed they placed too much stress on the trains. During the following off-season, the rolls were removed and replaced with more gentle S-bends that followed the profiling of the support structure. Thankfully, the S-bends were profiled to eliminate the valley point that previously existed between the zero-G rolls and 45-degree inclines. Robin received its new S-bend before Batman, allowing it to reopen in early April of 2007, while Batman waited for its new S-bend to be installed. Opening Robin first was completely typical, as for years it had been the default track. However, since Car 3 and possibly Car 2 on Robin's train had been totaled in the 2006 accident, Robin opened with Batman's blue train, which had been painted red, allowing the ride to use a full 5-car train. An indication of this were the silver circular decals on the sides of each car, which Batman had on its blue train, whereas the original Robin train had black circular decals. The cars were also lettered B1, B2, and so on, with the B likely standing for Batman. As the spring progressed, Batman's S-bend was installed while Robin continued operating. It was during this time period I got my only rides on the Chiller at the age of 11. I can still remember how ferocious the Cobra Roll was in the forward pass, but due to the use of only 4 pairs of boost limbs at the time, the Cobra Roll was much less intense on the return run. In order to get Batman operating, it was decided each track would operate a 4-car train instead of 5, since 1 or 2 of Robin's original cars were still unusable. Around June, Robin began testing a 4-car train, which was still Batman's train as the silver circular decals were still present. The 5th car would be left uncoupled from the rest of the train on Robin's maintenance track while this occurred. Testing of a 4-car train was successful, but Batman would never test a 4-car train, as cracks were discovered in the wheel bogies of the Batman train being used on Robin. As a result, operations of Robin were immediately stopped on June 28, 2007. Later that summer, the park decided they had had enough and announced the Chiller would unfortunately close for good. The ride was dismantled later that season along with the neighboring Movietown water effect to make way for Batman the Dark Knight, an indoor Wild Mouse coaster, a very unworthy replacement. The sad part is while coaster enthusiasts were upset about the Chiller's removal, the ride had such a troubling run at Great Adventure that the general public hardly seemed to notice its closure. The Chiller should have been one of Great Adventure's most popular coasters, as it was extremely unique and thrilling, just as the Mr. Freezes are at their respective parks. But the mix of the Chiller's sporadic operations, while Medusa, Nitro, Superman Ultimate Flight, King Ka, and El Toro all opening during the Chiller's tenure, meant it was quickly overshadowed, whereas had the ride remained in consistent operations during that time period, it would have held its own ground. Thankfully, as of 2025, the Flash Vertical Velocity now fills in as the Chiller's longtime replacement. In so many ways, the Flash addresses many of the issues that plague the Chiller. It has launch boost in all of its low points and is able to self-recover stalled trains. The ride even pays tribute to the Chiller by featuring the iconic zero-G roll into an incline. Although it's certainly less intense, but it's cool to see it return to the park. From what I understand, only Robin had ever cracked a wheel bogie, and a wheel bogie had never cracked on the Batman track or the Mr. Freeze coasters. Ironically, after only a few months of operation on Robin, the Batman train developed cracks in its wheel bogies. Even though Batman had operated less than Robin in the ride's later years, it goes to show that the Robin track was the issue. Both tracks even had the same zero-G roll, and for most of the ride's career, Robin was never boosted as high up the incline as Batman was, meaning Batman always took the roll at a greater speed in the reverse direction. In this example, Robin only used 3 pairs of boost limbs while Batman still used all 7 pairs. Even in the ride's early days when Robin still had all 7 pairs of boost limbs present, only the first first 5 pairs seemed to actually be active, as the rear car of the train never rode above the boost limbs like it does on Batman or the Mr. Freezes. This example in April of 1998 is actually the only time I've ever seen Robin utilize all 7 pairs of its boost limbs. So again, Batman always took the roll at a greater speed in the reverse direction. Yet Robin was the issue, and the only difference between Batman and Robin was the Cobra roll and top hat, suggesting the Cobra roll was the problem. After all, the Cobra roll was extremely intense. Trains were launched into it at the same speed trains were launched into the much taller top hat, so it was taken at rapid speeds and sustained heavy positive g-forces through the entire element, whereas the top hat on Batman was much less intense. Robin's Cobra roll was also unique in that the half loops were completely straight and not tilted to the left or right like they are on most other Cobra rolls, such as on Flight of Fear or its outdoor clones. By tilting the half loops, it leads to a less intense transition between the half loop and half corkscrew at the tops of the inversion. So Robin's straight Cobra roll may have placed more stress on the wheel bogies, along with the Cobra roll's overall ferocious intensity. Throughout the video, I've mentioned several reasons why Robin was the more problematic track, and I still stand by the idea that Batman should have instead been made the default track, even if it required more boost limbs to operate. Perhaps if this were the case, the 0G rolls would have never been removed, as according to a good number of people, it was the best element on both tracks of the attraction, and the ride was never the same with the S-bends. Now, to continue operating the chiller would have only been safe if Batman were the only track in operation. Robin clearly required modifications to continue safely operating, like strengthening its wheel bogies or slowing down its main launch so trains rode through the Cobra roll less intensely. But this would have also required moving the boost limbs lower down the incline since they were higher than the Cobra roll. In the end, I really wish Great Adventure had somehow gotten a Mr. Freeze clone instead of the chiller, as even if the chiller may have been a cooler attraction on paper, a Mr. Freeze clone would likely still be in operation today, just like the other 2 Mr. Freezes. Going back to 2006, when a wheel bogie broke on the Robin track of Chiller, it also shut down the other Six Flags premier limb launching coasters. This included both Mr. Freezes, as well as Joker's Jinx at Six Flags America, and Poltergeist at Six Flags Fiesta Texas, which both opened in 1999. The 2 rides are outdoor clones of Flight of Fear that use the more powerful limb launches introduced with the shuttle coasters. It's interesting to think that even with all the issues Six Flags faced with opening their 4 shuttle coasters, that they still purchased additional limb launching coasters from the same manufacturer. Anyway, from what I understand, the rides were all closed until new wheel bogies could be designed and manufactured. Unfortunately, this meant the ride sat closed for most of the 2006 season. Mr. Freeze at Six Flags St. Louis appears to have been the first to reopen, and it took until early October of that year, and the ride only had 1 train available as well, likely because not enough wheel bogies were manufactured for both its trains. From what I gather, the new wheel bogies were not produced by Premier but by the Six Flags engineering team. Today, both Mr. Freezes, Joker's Jinx, and Poltergeist still use a Six Flags designed wheel bogie that has been refined through several iterations. The Six Flags wheel bogies are not a single piece like Premier's bogies were, which allows for individual parts of the bogies to be replaced when needed. What would happen is during non-destructive testing, or NDT, during each off-season, whenever a Premier wheel bogie would fail NDT, the entire wheel bogie would have to be replaced, which was extremely expensive, with the Six Flags bogies being multiple pieces. If one piece fails NDT, just that piece can be replaced rather than the entire wheel bogie. Interestingly, Flight of Fear at Kings Island looks to use a different wheel bogie than the Chiller ever did. Each bogie only has 1 upstop wheel, whereas the shuttle coasters all opened with 2 upstop wheels. On March 22, 2012, Six Flags introduced Mr. Freeze Reverse Blast, in which the trains on both Mr. Freezes would be reversed in direction, meaning riders would launch from the station backwards, thus traversing the outbound lap in the backward direction, and then returning to the station in the forward direction. This is the only version of Mr. Freeze I've ridden, and it's absolutely fantastic. The process to create Mr. Freeze Reverse Blast may have been a bit more involved than you think. To run trains in the opposite direction, it meant a number of components had to be altered. Underneath the trains, the brake fins for the friction and magnetic brake systems had to be swapped, as the friction brake fin needed to remain on the right side, and the magnetic brake fin needed to remain on the left side to correspond with the track. The proximity sensors on the track also had to be adjusted as they interact with the brake fins to take their recordings, and the brake fins now sit much more forward on each car. The restraint release mechanism on the station tables, which unlocks unlocks each train's restraints also had to be moved. The original mounting point was here, but due to trains reversing directions, the release mechanism had to be remounted here. This, however, got in the way of this friction brake, so the right ski of this brake had to be cut shorter than the left ski in order to fit the release mechanism. Mr. Freeze at Six Flags Over Texas currently runs one train forward on A station and one train backward on B station. The trains are unable to switch between the different stations, as the release mechanism on A station has been put back in its original location to account for trains running in the forward direction. You can see the mounting point built for reverse trains is now covered up, but the B station still uses the reverse direction mounting point, as its release mechanism still needs to account for a backwards running train. Something else of interest is on the Texas Mr. Freeze, the front car of the backward train does not use a lead car body. Instead, a middle car body is used, and you can see how stubby the nose of the front car is compared to the lead car of the forward train. The Texas Mr. Freeze ran with the lead car body on its reverse trains for years. The Missouri Mr. Freeze still runs both its trains in the reverse direction, and the front cars of both trains still use true lead car bodies. At Six Flags Over Texas, the reason for the change to a middle car body on the reverse train is because with the lead car, the front bumper attached to the train does not stick out further than the nose of the car body. So in case the ride ever overshot the true home position on the station table, the bumper mounted to the station track would contact the car body rather than the train's bumper, which would certainly damage the car body. From what I understand, under travels on the station tables are much more common than overshoots, and the ride has all sorts of precautions built in to avoid an overshoot, which may be why Six Flags St. Louis still uses lead car bodies on its backward trains, but Six Flags Over Texas took an extra precaution with their Mr. Freeze. Even more intriguing, at the time of recording, the train running in the forward direction on the Texas Mr. Freeze is actually one of Chiller's trains. In 2018, which was 11 years after the Chiller closed, Six Flags Over Texas received the remaining Chiller ride vehicles. With the park being open year-round, it's advantageous to have 3 trains for Mr. Freeze so that the ride can always have 2 trains available for service, while the 3rd train undergoes its annual maintenance. While it was believed Mr. Freeze's 3rd train is Robin's train, it's actually Batman's train. When the train arrived at Six Flags Over Texas, it was still painted red from its brief run on the Robin track in 2007, as you can spot the silver circular decals which come from the Batman train. Six Flags Over Texas also received the 3 cars from Robin's original train that were not totaled in the 2006 accident. These cars have black circular decals that were part of Robin's original train. From what I understand, Robin's original cars are not operated on the Texas Mr. Freeze, and are only used for spare parts to help with maintenance of the other 3 trains. We can also note that one of the middle car bodies from this Robin ride vehicle is missing, so perhaps the park took this car body to use on the lead car of the backwards running train. Even more interesting, when the Chiller was deconstructed at Great Adventure, its track and support pieces were relocated to a storage lot 5 miles away in the town of Plumstead. Using the historical image tool on Google Earth, the track pieces can be seen at the storage lot in 2008 and 2010, but in September of 2013, the pieces disappeared. Jumping to the park Beto Carreiro World in Brazil, we'll notice that in July of 2011, the storage lot is empty, and then in October of 2012, the Chiller's track and supports magically appear. It turns out Beto Carreiro World purchased the defunct coaster in 2012 and hoped to reopen it sometime in 2014. Along with the existing ride vehicles, Beto Carreiro World even secured the original limbs used on the Chiller, which were believed to be in a working order. The original estimate to refurbish, reconstruct, and reopen the ride was about $5 million US, with the most critical aspect of work revolving around upgrading the electrical panels and power station at the park. However, for one reason or another, Beto Carreiro World was unable to build the attraction, and the track and support pieces, as well as Chiller's trains, remained on site. Sometime between March of 2014 and March of 2015, the Chiller's track and support pieces disappeared, likely because Beto Carreiro World gave up on rebuilding the coaster and sold it for scrap. Then from what I understand, the scrapyard ended up selling the ride vehicles back to Six Flags, which is how they ended up at Six Flags Over Texas for use on Mr. Freeze. Nowadays, operations of both Mr. Freezes remain largely consistent. The most common issue that affect their operations are when trains stop short on the station tables following a ride cycle, but this is such an easy fix, allowing the rides to reopen very shortly after. More major events like when a train valleys continues to remain rare, and happens maybe once a year at most, which is great when you consider the rather ridiculous nature of how dependent the rides are on electricity for trains to return to the station. The limbs are also quite reliable and seem to hardly swell up these days due to them overheating, so they actually don't require many replacements. The only troubling aspect of running the Mr. Freezes is the tedious maintenance required to keep the trains and launch system in perfect alignment, which is something not required with the upkeep of most roller coasters. Remember that if the alignment of the trains and limbs are not maintained to pinpoint precision, the reactor plates can strike the metal housings of the limbs. As the side-mounted guide wheels of the trains wear, the train needs to be constantly adjusted back to the center of the track. As the main road wheels which run above the track wear, the reactor plates need to be adjusted upward so that they maintain perfect alignment with the limbs. Then whenever a wheel is replaced, further adjustments are required to keep the reactor plates in alignment by just millimeters. The reactor plates are also checked during morning inspections to ensure they're perfectly level. If they aren't, the high or low points are adjusted with some good old-fashioned muscle and hand tools to make them as straight as possible. The limbs also need to be adjusted and can be raised or lowered at the four corners of each motor where the bracket of the limb is mounted. Once a week, it's required by the manufacturer that a train be slowly pushed through the main launch. It is then noted where any contacting is heard between the limbs and reactor plates, and any affected limbs are adjusted accordingly. However, adjusting the limbs mounted beneath the catwalk of the launch track is not an easy task, which makes adjusting half of the launch limbs very difficult. It's even harder to adjust the limbs on the vertical spike, as a train can't be slowly pushed through the vertical section of track over 100 feet in the air. Instead, it's common for maintenance to paint the inside of the metal brackets of the limbs, and after a few test cycles, see where the paint wore off. This lets them know which of the limbs are affected and how they should be adjusted. But at a vertical angle so high in the air, adjusting the limbs or replacing them remains extremely challenging. As to the future of both Mr. Freezes, I hope they remain for many more years to come. Prior to the merger of Six Flags and Cedar Fair, I never questioned that either would be removed in the near future, as they're not only the signature rides at their respective parks, but the best rides at their respective parks in my opinion. But the newly combined Six Flags Entertainment Corporation has been ruthless with the unannounced and sudden closures of many noteworthy rides such as Kingda Ka. Thankfully, it's probably safe to assume that operating the Mr. Freezes is much cheaper than the cost of running and maintaining Kingda Ka, as Ka was certainly a much more problematic roller coaster. And even with the added maintenance the Mr. Freezes require compared to most roller coasters, there's no way they need more maintenance than Kingda Ka did. The only other challenges with the Mr. Freezes I can think of is the added cost of running them due to the immense electricity they require. While the limbs are quite reliable and don't seem to really need replacement, perhaps converting the launch systems from limbs to LSMs would make the Mr. Freezes much less costly to run as well as less tedious to maintain. This would likely require new trains, but today's LSMs are extremely reliable and energy efficient. LSMs could also replace the two brake systems used on the ride's launch track, which would make the rides less complex with less parts to maintain. LSMs could better assist with parking trains on the station tables, which would solve the ride's most common cause of downtime. Perhaps an indication Six Flags has no immediate plans to close the Mr. Freezes is that the original Cedar Fair company, which as I understand are making most of the decisions in the new Six Flags company, have continued operating their Flight of Fears for years with no signs of getting rid of them. In fact, for the 2025 season, Flight of Fear at King's Dominion is receiving many cosmetic upgrades to make it better fit within the park's new jungle expedition area. Meanwhile, both Flight of Fears possess many of the same issues that affect the Mr. Freezes, such as their added likeliness to Valley Mid-Circuit, or the additional maintenance required to keep the trains and launch system in perfect alignment. I find that the Mr. Freezes offer a dramatically better ride experience than the Flight of Fears, and I think most of you would agree with me on that. So if the Cedar Fair parks have held on to two of their limb launching coasters for so long, why not also hang on to the even superior limb launching shuttle coasters? So if anyone from the Six Flags Entertainment Corporation is watching, I think it's in your best interest to keep both both Mr. Freezes for many more years to come. Both rides are star attractions, and like I just mentioned, I think they're the best rides at both their respective parks. They're also extremely intriguing with the way they were designed and operate, helping nerds like myself and all of you watching to appreciate every little thing about them. To all the viewers, I want to thank you so much for watching, and hopefully you learned many new things in my longest video yet. Be sure to comment below what you thought of the video as well as your thoughts on Mr. Freeze and the Chiller. If you enjoyed the video, definitely be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more nerdy content just like this. Thank you all so much for your continued support, and I'll see you all in my next video.